Hey everybody, welcome to JPD Weekly. Sorry we don't have the normal set up, but again, working on a new documentary, so all the stuff is set up where the desk usually goes. But that's okay. We can deal with this. So, I wanted to talk about a couple of parables of Jesus because I think it helps explain where we are today and where we're not yet. So a lot of people will look at the parables of Matthew 13 and will say that that is describing the kingdom basically coming to earth, or they'll use it as evidence that we're in the kingdom right now. Now, for those of you who know me and follow me, I'm a dispensationalist, premillennial, pre-trib rapture kind of guy. When you look at these parables, I think that they actually lend a lot of support to the dispensationalist view. And I think what we're missing through these parables is context. So I wanted to start with Matthew 12 to actually see what the background context is of these parables. And then I wanted to go through at least two today. And we might do more later. I think after you get the first two, you'll understand the rest. But we'll at least start with the first two, and then we'll see where time takes us. So let's start in Matthew 12, and I have Bible Gateway open over here. So we'll be reading over here. Matthew 12, Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. All right, and I'm reading from the New King James Version, but it says, "At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and he began to pluck heads of grain to eat. And the Pharisees saw it. They said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.'" Now, this is interesting here, because what they're complaining about was something that was never meant to be for everybody, for every Jew. That was a priestly thing. But the Pharisees, one of the things they were doing is trying to basically go out of their way to fulfill the, you'll go out to the world, be priests and kings. They were trying to fulfill that outside of God's timing and God's wishes. And so they put the priestly law onto everybody, or at least they were trying to. They were trying to put the priestly law onto everybody. So there are times where, for the priests, you're not supposed to do certain things. You got to wash your hands, or, you can't, if you're a priest on the Sabbath and you're supposed to be doing certain duties, there's just some things you can't do. This is where the whole, if you're, if you have an animal that goes off, you're going to go get it. You're going to go get it if it's a Sabbath or not. But the problem here was the Pharisees were trying to put the priestly code onto everybody, and that when you read through the Torah, that's not at all what God originally intended. So that's what the Pharisees were trying to do. That adds a little bit of context to understand why Jesus responds the way he does, and why it actually wasn't sinful at all. The Pharisees were adding extra rules to people who weren't even priests anyway. They were trying to put everybody under that law so everybody could be holy enough to fulfill that prophecy. Oh, and actually, I wrote a little bit about this in a book that I have coming out called The Lost Prophecies of Qumran. So if you want some information kind of not only on the Pharisees and Sadducees, but also the Essenes at that time, what they believed in, what the Dead Sea Scrolls say, what their history is, what prophecies they hold, all that kind of stuff. Lost Prophecies of Qumran is a book I just put out. So by the time that this is airing, I'm not sure if it's going to be out yet. If not, though, just keep your eyes on Skywatch TV. It'll be out soon. I also just recorded 4 episodes of Skywatch TV with Dr. Ken Johnson on the same topic. He's got a new sort of compilation book coming out, so make sure you keep your eyes on that. All right. Continuing on. Excuse me. It says, "But he said to them, 'Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. See it right there, the priests. Or have you not read in the law on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord, even to the Sabbath. So here's the healing on the Sabbath. So the whole context here, when you read through the Gospels, this is the turning point. So when Jesus first arrives on the scene, he is the Messiah to Israel. He is what that prophecy, how it's supposed to be fulfilled. I don't even want to say originally. The way that things ended up was always the plan. That's plan A, Okay, so there was never a plan B. And sometimes we get insulted because, or people try to insult us because they say that we believe we're teaching like plan B, like God messed up and he had to do something else. All right, that's a straw man, obviously. That's not, no dispensationalist is saying it that way. But what Jesus does is he will give people a chance, knowing full well what they're going to do. Just think of Adam and Eve in the garden. All right. God did all that knowing that they were going to take of the tree and sin and, rebel against him. So what is all of this just plan B then? Did God mess up? No, of course not. No one would say that. No actual Christian would say that, right? Because a God that can mess up isn't God. So that was always the plan, yet because they sinned, there was a deviation from a course that could have existed, if that makes sense. Adam and Eve didn't have to sin. They chose that. We have free will. That's the only way that true love can be a real thing, is if it's done freely by choice. So if we're actually going to love and serve God, we can't be forced into it. We have to make that choice ourselves. So they had a choice. They rebelled. God knew that they were going to do that, and God still loved them so much that he provided a way for them to be reconciled back to God. So now that was always to be done through Israel, still will be. And when the Messiah came, when Jesus came, it was a fulfillment of that. It was basically, this is how we're going to bring the kingdom on earth. This is how, this is the path that can be taken on how we can bring the kingdom in. Now, God always knew that Jesus was going to be rejected, obviously. He always knew that. There's plenty of prophecies in Isaiah, in like the Old Testament, talking about how the Messiah would be rejected. So that the Messiah being rejected was always plan A. All right. I just want to make that really clear, because if you go down this line of study, you're going to get a lot of pushback, and you're going to get a lot of people telling you you're wrong and you're stupid and all that stuff. So it helps to have the context to know what's going on. So Jesus was always supposed to come, and he was going to offer the kingdom to Israel and basically say, hey, Israel, we can fulfill this prophecy now, but you got to do it my way, because, again, Jesus is God in the flesh, so it's God saying, you got to do it this way, my way. And they could have set up Jesus as king, or, who knows how all of that would have played out. It almost doesn't matter, because that's not reality. That's not what happened. But that is a path that could have been taken. It's just like Adam and Eve. They could have not sinned. Nobody forced them to sin. So it's the same kind of thing. Nobody forced Israel to reject Jesus. And we get so used to, in our church age, we get so used to having a personal relationship with Jesus, we forget that Israel kind of had like a national relationship with God almost. And when Jesus came, it was for Israel, but Israel nationally rejected Jesus, and that's where all the trouble comes in. Now, some individuals accepted Jesus. Obviously, we have the apostles, and we have people around in that area that accepted him, but nationally, Israel has never accepted Jesus as Messiah. Now, Israel will in the future. It's a future thing. So Matthew 12 is a description of the rejection of national Israel, the rejection of the Messiah, the rejection of the Israel's leadership, their leadership at the time rejecting Messiah, and what that now means. So instead of the kingdom coming during the time of Jesus, if they would have accepted him. Well, now we're going to do this church age thing, which was always the plan anyway, but it hadn't been revealed yet. So that's kind of some of the context. So having that background, we're going to read through the rest of Matthew 12, and then we're going to get into the parables in the following chapter. So let's continue on. Healing on the Sabbath. Now when he had departed from there and went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to hear on the Sabbath, that they might accuse him? And he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep? Oh, here's what we were talking about before. Who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value, then, is a man than sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. And the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. So that's another one of those things, those priestly things, and he's saying here, look, who has one sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, would not lift it out. So apparently that's something that they would do. It's interesting too, because even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are places where it says that it's unlawful to do this exact thing, to like, it even says that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I remember when I first read that, I was like, that sounds like a Pharisee thing. What is that? Well, it wasn't that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they weren't applying that to everybody. That was only for priests. That specific rule was only for priests. So you do see some of that, but they didn't try to put it on everybody. So it's not that the Pharisees were doing this stuff. It's that they were extending it out from the priesthood and trying to impose it on everybody, like every Jew, which that is incredibly sinful. And they thought that they could do this better than Jesus, which is why they end up rejecting Jesus. They don't agree with Jesus' way of doing things, and so they're going to reject him, thinking they can do a better job. And we know historically that obviously did not happen. They did not do a better job. They were destroyed. Continuing on, excuse me. But when Jesus knew it, he withdrew from there, and great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. And yet he warned them not to make him known, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, behold, my servant who I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel or cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax he will not quench, till he sends forth justice to victory, and in his name Gentiles will trust. Well, we certainly have that today, but so this was the original, like this is the original plan. So it was always known that the Messiah would be rejected, but look what it says here. It says that he will declare justice to the Gentiles. In his name, Gentiles will trust. Well, Jesus was taking that on himself, and the Pharisees wanted that job. The Pharisees wanted to be the ones to spread the kingdom across the world. And they had a bunch of weird interpretations of stuff like that. So that's where we get to the rejection itself. And this is all about Israel and the transition from the age of Torah to the age of grace, which is what we're in now. So let's continue on. Then one was brought to him who was demon-possessed, blind and mute, and he healed him, so that the blind and mute man both spoke and saw. And all the multitudes were amazed and said, could this be the son of David? The Messiah. Now, when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of demons, or, just Satan is fine. But Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation. That's talking about Israel. And every city or house divided against itself will not stand. And that's exactly what happened. Because they were divided. There were people who followed Messiah, people who followed Jesus, and people who didn't. The ones who followed Messiah went out and preached the gospel to the earth, while the rest stayed behind. And 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, and it was a big disaster. And this exactly came true. The kingdom divided against itself did not stand. So it says, if Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? And if I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore they shall be your judges. But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, surely the kingdom of God has come upon you. Or how can one enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods, unless he first binds the strong man, and then he will plunder his house? He who is not with me is against me, and who does not gather with me scatters abroad. Excuse me. Therefore I say to you, every sin and blasphemy will be forgiven men, but the blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven men. Anyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man, it will be forgiven him, but anyone who speaks against the Holy Spirit, it will not be forgiven him, either in this age nor the age to come. Okay, this age nor the age to come, he's talking about the age of Torah, and the age to come is the church age, the age of grace. And a lot of people think that this was made up by like Darby or something, like that dispensationalism was like invented recently. That's completely untrue. When you read through the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were absolutely dispensationalists. I mean, they had like the way that their whole calendar worked. Were split up into ages. So there was a 2,000-year age of Torah, and then right at this point, in this time of history, the switch happened to the next dispensation of the age of grace. And this is the story of that transition, how that came to be. Now, according to the Essene calendar, if we understand it correctly, the actual beginning of the next age happened in 75 AD. So that would have been 50 so years after this, a little bit less than that. But this is how the transition starts. So there's not like an exact like day where, you know, I mean there is, but when you think about like events, the events are the things that really show what age you're in, what's going on. So it's not like, you know, December 2nd. AD 75 is exactly when the next age starts. You know, it wasn't predicted like that. It was just like when this and this and this happens, then this will be the case. We can look back and we might be able to put an exact date on it now if we had the historical records to do that, but by looking at the events that happened. But in that sense, an exact date doesn't really matter because that's not the point. The point is that it happened. There was a transition. We are in a new age now. And, by the way, if ages are 2,000 years long, if the Essenes are correct about that, if the Dead Sea Scroll calendar is correct about that, we're coming up at the end of our 2,000 years. So, you know, we'll see. Not setting dates, but it's just something interesting to think about. So this is that whole story of how that transition happened, why it didn't just go immediately into the kingdom. I mean, isn't that what the Messiah was supposed to do? Why doesn't it happen? Again, it's because men have free will. Human beings have free will. And they rejected the Messiah. So let's continue on here. It says, a tree is known by its fruit. Either make the tree good and its fruit good, or else make the tree bad and its fruit bad, for a tree is known by its fruit. Brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart bring forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give an account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Okay. So the scribes and Pharisees ask for a sign. They you know, Jesus says he's not going to give it. So, you know, we'll just read through it. So then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of Jonah, of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. So he's explaining how bad the Pharisees' sin of rejecting Jesus, how serious of a sin that is. It's an eternally damnable sin. 43. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places seeking rest and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it be with this wicked generation. And that is exactly what happened with that wicked generation. The last state of that generation, around 70 AD, was far worse than the first state. So, and you could even think of Israel just as a whole. The way that Israel started out with Moses was relatively good. There's always been problems, because we are human beings after all. But the last state of Israel was far worse. And even more, you could even think of that prophetically, because we know that Israel still has 7 years left on its timetable, and that is going to be the absolute worst of it. The last state of Israel is far worse than the first. So you could even think of that prophetically, but I think mainly he's talking about, because he says right here, this wicked generation. So he's talking about that time. Okay. While he was still talking to the multitudes, behold, his mother and brothers stood outside, seeking to speak with him. Then one said to him, look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside, seeking to speak with you. But he answered and said to the one who told him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And he stretched out his hand toward his disciples and said, here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. All right. So he's talking in family terms here, saying that, this is a lot more than just, I tell you what to do and you do it. This is a family I'm inviting you into. And that's the kind of a family thing that the Pharisees rejected, which is what started the whole problem. So immediately after this rejection, this national rejection, because again, these are the leaders of Israel. They are rejecting their Messiah that was promised. It happens in Matthew 12. That's when that rejection actually happens. That's because that's when it's like blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. That's when it's like, all right, clearly nothing I can do is going to make you believe. So now we're gonna know that that's not happening, that you're not going to accept the Messiah. So we're going to do what was always planned in the first place. We're going to do this church thing. Now, nobody knew about the church yet. Because again, if they did, that would be in violation of Ephesians 3. Oh, and another interesting thing too is when you read through the Dead Sea Scrolls, you get allusions to things, just like in the Old Testament. You get like allusions, but you don't get like the church. You don't get described Gentiles entering into the promises of the Jews as being heirs. And that's a really important part of it. That's what Ephesians 3 is all about. That no one knew that the Gentiles would be able to be seen as fellow heirs to these things. So nobody knew that. And Dead Sea Scrolls didn't know that. The Bible didn't know that. Nobody knew that. Now it is strange because they had hints of it, just like there's hints of it in the Old Testament. There's hints of it. There's hints of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls too. It talks about like synagogues of the Gentiles and stuff, and just how in Matthew 12 it said that the Gentiles will believe the Messiah and stuff. Well, sure, that could happen if the kingdom came, or it could happen if this church age thing occurred. So I think most people, because nobody foresaw the church except Jesus, obviously, but nobody foresaw it. So I think that everybody reading those prophecies assumed that it would have to do with the kingdom, but there's kind of a pre-kingdom age. There's the church age, which is a different dispensation. It's a different deal all on its own, and that's what we're in right now. So with that context, we can look at the parables, because the next thing, and it's actually on the same day as we learn, the same day that this happened, right after, Jesus starts telling all these parables. And he's explaining what's happening now, what the next age is going to look like, and how it's not going to be as good as it would have been had they accepted their Messiah, and they could have just, instilled the kingdom at that point. Of course, God always knew that rejection was going to happen, so that's why we're doing the church age thing. So now it's time for Jesus to start explaining what the next age is going to look like, what it's going to be like. And he doesn't just come out and say it because, again, imagine yourself as a Jew living at this time, and you read the scriptures, you believe all of it, you believe the Messiah, you don't believe the silly Pharisees and Sadducees. Like let's say you're maybe in a scene or something, and you're waiting for the Messiah, and then he finally comes, and you believe him, and you spend a lot of time with him, you get to know him personally, and you're looking forward to him bringing the kingdom. People ask, well, why doesn't Jesus just say, hey, we're not doing the kingdom, it's the church now? Can you imagine how devastating that would have been to hear that? I mean, he lets them down a little more gently. That's why he starts talking with these parables to kind of explain things, explain what's going on. So when the ball finally does drop, it'll make sense, and they have this whole foundation of teachings to understand it and to navigate the next 2,000 years or so. So that's the context. Now we can go on to let's start with the parable of the sower. And you'll see how these are not talking about, this is what we must do now to bring in the kingdom. And that's a big teaching nowadays, this kingdom out now stuff. It's not right. It's wrong. Everybody who's tried to do it through the past 2,000 years, the Dark Ages. The problem is we're still fallible human beings, and we're not going to have perfect theology. As perfect as we think our theology is, it's not going to be perfect. And because it's not perfect, if we try to instill that onto everybody, it's just that same sin, that the same Pharisee sin of trying to impose all this stuff and not just letting God do what God is going to do and just listening to God. We're never commanded to bring the kingdom into this age now. That's a future thing when Jesus returns. Now, we are commanded to do things. We got to take care of the world and take care of each other and love each other and spread the gospel. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that adding on to that, we now also have to bring in the actual kingdom. The whole process of how the kingdom comes is all laid out in Revelation. That is the process of how Jesus returns to set up the kingdom on earth. So we already know that. So right now, this is Jesus talking about basically, he's been rejected. National Israel is not going to set up Jesus as king or Messiah or anything like that. They're not going to recognize him. They think that he's possessed by Satan, which is like the ultimate blasphemy. That's how do you get worse than that? So he's trying to explain to his friends now, well, what's going to happen. So Matthew 13 picks up right where we left off from Matthew 12. And that's why I wanted to read Matthew 12 first. So it says, on the same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. A great multitude were gathered together to him, so that he got in a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. And he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, behold, a sower went out to sow. So here's the first parable. A sower went out to sow. That's planting in a field. As he sowed, as he was like dropping seeds, trying to plant seeds, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. So, because of another parable that comes up a little later, would we say that these birds are good? Because God's not the author of confusion. So when Jesus tells like a bunch of parables in a row like this, we can assume that the analogies, the characters in these parables, that they're going to represent the same kinds of things. And you get this biblically too. So like birds, well, let's read, we'll talk more about it, but let's read the rest of it first. Some fell on stony places where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away, and some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground and yielded a crop, some 100, some 60, some 30. Who has ears to hear, let him hear. And, the disciples even come to ask him, why do you speak to them in parables? That's verse 10. And he answered and said to them, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance, but whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull, their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes have been closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts, and turn, so that I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly, I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. So that also adds to, explains the parables thing. Like, why specifically parables? Why not just come out and say it? There's always these mixed crowds too. There's always, Pharisees and Sadducees around. So Jesus would talk to people like this. For one thing, it's sort of a mercy on the Pharisees. If Jesus were to just speak directly and just say, say whatever, well, then that would just be adding more judgment against the Pharisees, because they're already not going to believe it. And if Jesus says it plainly, then they're gonna know what he's saying, but they're not gonna believe it. So parables, they can just ignore it, not pay attention to it, and then Jesus' true followers actually will, and they'll want to know. I mean, it's a way to kind of separate his audience here. And then Jesus goes on to explain the parable of the sower. So let's look at Jesus's explanation, and then I want to say some things about it. So up here, verse 18, therefore hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who received seeds by the wayside. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. Now he who received seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word and become unfruitful. But he who received seed on the ground, on the good ground, is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Okay. And then later we're going to get to the parable of the wheat and the tares. But so I want to go through some things here. First, nothing in here says anything about bringing the kingdom in. And the only thing that people can really point to is because he says the word of the kingdom. That's the word of the kingdom and the kingdom. Like, would you say the word of God and God are two different things? Like, it depends on context, of course. If we're talking about word of God in the way that, John uses it, the logos, well, that's something different. But, a lot of times when us as 21st century Christians say the word of God, we're talking about the Bible. And we would not look at a physical book and say that is God. But there's obviously a relation there. So, the kingdom is more of an inheritance. It's what our inheritance is, and that's the word, that's the promise that's coming. So I want to talk a little bit about this and get into some of the things that we discussed through that. Now, again, a lot of people say today, it's a really popular teaching, that the parable of the sower teaches kingdom now theology, that the kingdom is coming onto earth now, and it's here, and it's in us, and we need to spread that out. And there was a time I sort of believed some of that too, but that's not the point. The point is to bring people into the inheritance, to make more brothers and sisters. That's what all the family language is about, because the kingdom is an inheritance. It's when the right time comes, we get to inherit that. That's the promise. It's not here yet. We're not asking for our inheritance right now in our fallen state. I mean, it would be like, think of the parable of the two sons. One son basically goes off, leaves his inheritance behind. He parties it up for a while. Well, imagine if the dad would have given that son his inheritance early, before he came back home. That would have been disaster. Well, that would be like if we're supposed to bring in the kingdom now or something. In this fallen world, with all of these people that don't accept Jesus, and we've had, and people say, well, that's the point. We're going to be bringing in the kingdom so they will. Well, we've had 2,000 years. We've had 2,000 years with that. And I mean, I don't know. Are we stronger than they were in the first century as a church? I mean, I don't know. I don't know about that. So I think that a more consistent interpretation is that these parables are explaining the next age, the church age, the next dispensation, what's going to happen now. So the sower, he's preaching the gospel, right, with various results. I don't see how, and again, it's because people see that word of the kingdom and it trips them up. It just trips them up because they think of the kingdom as like this one thing, and not as something that is like an inheritance that you're entering into with family, and we want to bring in other brothers and sisters as part of the family for this inheritance. If this was about the kingdom and bringing the kingdom in, then the varying results don't tend to make sense, because in verse 3 we have the sower that went out to sow. The word of the kingdom enters people's hearts in verse 19, but only one type of soil is actually fruitful. Excuse me. And that's in verse 23. And also, Satan is active in verse 19. So, I want to read a quote. There's a really good book called The Prophetic Parables of Matthew 13. It's an older book, but it's from A.W. Pink. And it's really brilliantly written. There's a couple of things in there that I'm not totally sure about. A.W. Pink makes a distinction between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God, and so far I don't know that there's a difference between the two. So far. If there is, I'll do a video on it. But I wasn't completely convinced by A.W. Pink's arguments in the book, although he brings up some good points. I'm on the fence. I don't know about that one yet. As of right now, I think the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven, that language, I think they're both the same thing. I think it's the same thing. But, and also, I think, if I remember right, I think A.W. Pink later on in his life got into some weird stuff that I wouldn't agree with. Not like anything really bad, just some theological interpretations that I don't know I would agree with. But besides that, it's a really good book. Again, none of us are going to have perfect theology, so we need to just get it where we can and just know that not every teacher, myself included, not every teacher is going to have it perfectly right all the time. But anyway, so this is a quote. He says, and again, this is from the Prophetic Parables of Matthew 13, A.W. Pink. You can find that on Amazon really cheap, by the way. But it says, he's quoted as saying, quote, "The words went forth to sow," or as Mark's gospel puts it, went out, were indicative of the great dispensational change which was soon to be introduced. There was no longer to be a planting of vines or fig trees in Israel, but a going out of the mercy of God unto the Gentiles. Therefore, what we have here is the broadcast sowing of the seed in the field at large, for as verse 38 tells us, the field is the world. Okay? There's also a couple of quotes here, too, that talk about okay. Yeah, all right. That talk about this. So Isaiah 2 and 3 says, "Now it will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it." Does that sound like today? "And many peoples will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." That's the kingdom. That's a future thing. That's when Jesus comes back and establishes the kingdom on earth. Now, the only way to make that make sense with the kingdom now stuff that says the parables are about bringing the kingdom in today is you gotta totally allegorize that. Isaiah 2, 2, and 3. You got to totally allegorize that and say, well, that is happening today. They're metaphorically going up to the mountain of God in their hearts, or, it's got to be something like that. And that's usually what they do. By the way, the Pharisees did that too. It was called oral Torah. And it's what eventually became the Talmud and things like that. But they had issues with that too. So that's not a mistake we want to follow ourselves, or at least we want to try to avoid that as much as possible. Zechariah 14, 16 through 18 says, "Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths." Does that sound like today? "And it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. If the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths." Now, that doesn't sound anything like today unless you allegorize that and you twist it completely out of its original meaning. It's a prophetic verse. This is what it's like when the Messiah is ruling over the earth. This is what it's like. And we are not living in that time yet. Unless you want to allegorize this and just make up your own theology, in which case I personally would advise against calling that biblical interpretation or saying that it's like so obvious anybody can see it. Again, we're all going to have to answer for things that we say. We also hear that the word of the kingdom enters people's hearts. So Matthew 13, 19 says, "When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in the heart." So A.W. Pink has another quote. In verse 19, it is called the word of the kingdom, while in verse 38 we read, "The good seed are the children of the kingdom. Like produces like. The word of the kingdom produces sons of the kingdom. The fruit is according to the seed." Okay, so it's not because we have language later that talks about sons of the kingdom and stuff. It's an heirship. We're heirs. We're heirs to the kingdom. So that's why we're children of the kingdom. Matthew 13:38. Again, says, "And the field is the world, and as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom. The tares are the sons of the evil one." So that one is something we're going to look at a little later, but we get the same imagery in the other parables. So, the field is the world. And that's important to notice, too. Now, about the sons and heirs and all that stuff, Galatians 4:7 says, "Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God." There's another quote I wanted to share from Stanley Toussaint and J.A. Quine from No, Not Yet, The Contingency of God's Promised Kingdom. And you can get this at Bibliotheca Sacra 164. It's April to June 2007 edition. And I believe it's page 140. Oh, by the way, if you want like a really good full teaching on all this, Dr. Andy Woods has a YouTube series called The Coming to Kingdom, and actually here on Daily Renegade, I've interviewed him on this topic before. You can just go to, if you're watching this at dailyrenegade.com, just go to the Sharpening Report, or you can search for Andy Woods or whatever. You'll find it on there, but I've interviewed him specifically on this topic, and we went through some of these parables together. Okay. We get more of this inheritance language later on. Matthew 25:34 says, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you in the foundation of the world.'" Okay, so if the kingdom was already brought in, the decision would have already been made if they were in the kingdom or not. You either are or you aren't if the kingdom is on earth, right? But this one, if he's saying come and inherit the kingdom, now is the time to come inherit the kingdom, and this is like this is like way later in the future, then obviously the kingdom has not been inherited yet. So it's our inheritance that we haven't inherited yet, because it's not time for that. Just like if you have a grandparent and they write you in their will, well, you have an inheritance, but it's not time for it yet. The inheritance exists, it's just not with you at that moment. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like that. We also learned that only one type of soil is fruitful, and even on that fruitful soil, it's only going to be, some people will be able to do it 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So there's like a decline there. Yet, Isaiah 11:9, speaking about the kingdom, says, "They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." So that's the kingdom. Does that sound like there are 3 out of 4 types of soil out there that will not accept this kingdom, even though it's like honor, like that? Those two things, those two ideas don't go together. Now, what does go together is if we're in a church age, we're supposed to be presenting the gospel to people. We're to go out, and a lot of people are going to reject it, but you might get a few that actually accept it. But even then, some people are going to be able to, get 100 people saved. Some people might only be able to get a couple people saved. So that is more consistent, because Isaiah 11:9 says the whole earth, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. Now, there are people that will try and say that describes today, and I would disagree. Now, there's widespread knowledge of Christianity generally, but not acceptance. So when we think about the kingdom and how it's prophesied, everybody's going to know who Jesus is because he's going to be there ruling. And if a nation decides to not do what he says, then they don't get rain. And, there's all this stuff that it's just not the way the world functions today. And the only way that this makes sense is if there's a set of dispensational, times where things are different than they were before. What doesn't make sense is that everything's the same all the time, and we need to allegorize this to make it fit. That doesn't make sense. Here's another quote from A.W. Pink about this specific verse. He says, quote, "In other words, we are shown what the results of this broadcast sowing of the seed would be. First of all, most of the ground upon which it fell would prove unfavorable. The hard, shallow, and thorny soils were uncongenial to productiveness. Second, external opposition would be encountered. The birds of the air will come and catch it away. Third, the sun would scorch, and that which was lacking in moisture at its roots would wither away. Only a fractional part of the seed sown would yield any increase, and thus all expectations for the ultimate universal triumph of the gospel were removed." I'm going to read that line again. Only a fractional part of the seed sown would yield any increase, and thus all expectations for the ultimate universal triumph of the gospel were removed. The plain teaching of our present parable should at once dissipate the optimistic but vain dreams of post-millennial people. But instead of that, the Lord himself has plainly warned us that instead of the fruitage from the gospel showing an increase, there would be a marked decrease. For when speaking of the fruit borne, he said, "which also bears fruit and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So not, it's not like we plant it and it just grows and spread. That can happen, but usually what happens is people reject it. You might get a few people that really respond to it, but then again, even if you get 100, of that 100, how many are the birds going to come take away? How many are the sun going to scorch? How many are actually going to stick with it and actually be truly converted? A lot of people end up falling away. And then also what we looked at before, Matthew 13:19, Satan is active. Now we know in the kingdom Satan is not active because he's bound in the abyss for 1,000 years, and that's the point of the kingdom. It's a Sabbath. It's like a long 1,000-year Sabbath rest after 6,000 years before it, if you believe in the Essene Dead Sea Scroll calendar stuff. But even if you don't, that's totally fine. It doesn't really change the topic here. But it says, Matthew 13:19 says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road. Revelation 21-3 says, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key to the abyss and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon and the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. Oh, okay. And then so that's talking about what the transition from our age into the kingdom will be like. That's one aspect of it. Satan isn't going to be present. He'll be present at the very end when he's let loose, but that's transitioning into the eternal state. That's getting ready for judgment. That's another transition period. So you see a lot of these transition periods.
Well, we do have a lot more to talk about, but first I have to tell you about Cornerstone Asset Metals. Concerning the economically unstable times that we live in, it is a great idea to convert some of your savings into real money. Now, there's a big difference between what we call real money, which actually is currency. So our dollar is currency, which fluctuates. Real money, like silver, is a store of value over time. So the best way to think of it is like this. If you had saved $1,000 in cash, back from the late 1960s, that $1,000 would still be $1,000, but it would buy you significantly less today due to inflation. But if you saved that same $1,000 in silver back in the 60s, it would be around $28,000 today, which is amazing. One of the best ways to protect your purchasing power is in real money, more specifically silver. You can buy and have the metal shipped discreetly to your door, and what most people don't know is that you can actually convert your IRA or even a 401k into physical silver rather than having all your life savings tied up in the paper fiat system, which is subject to hyperinflation. Go to dailyrenegade.com and click on the Cornerstone Asset Metals banner and sign up to get your free silver report. One of the financial experts will speak with you and find out the best way to protect your savings going forward in these uncertain times. You will find that under that banner, you will find a free full episode of The Sharpening Report with Terry Saka from Cornerstone. And we talk about their ministry, about what they do for people with silver and helping people protect against hyperinflation and the paper fiat system and basically the beast system that we're all wrapped up in. The Cornerstone is helping people get free of that, and they're Christian. You can see their testimony in that video. Fantastic people, and it's literally the only company that I personally trust with my silver. So. Again, head on over to dailyrenegade.com, click on that banner. You can watch that free episode of The Sharpening Report to get more information, and let them know that you heard about them through us.
Yeah, I think we're going to do, I think I want to talk about the wheat and the tares, but we're going to do that in members only. So if you haven't had a chance to already, head on over to dailyrenegade.com, get a membership today. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year. I highly suggest getting the $100 a year because it's technically cheaper in the long run. Instead of paying $120, you're paying $100. You just got to do it once. You don't have to think about it for a whole year. It's a great deal. And then you have full access to everything we provide at Daily Renegade. It's not just this show, and it's not just me. We have other amazing hosts like Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. He hosts a show with us. And there's lots more stuff. You can go to dailyrenegade.com. You can check it out. Even on the homepage, we have a couple of free episodes if you want to check those out. It'd be a good thing to do. But yeah, so if you are a member, hang on the line. We got a lot more to talk about. Everybody else, thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, love you all. Take care and God bless.